The truck didn't slow down. That's the part nobody talks about afterward. Not the ice, not the barrier, not the 100 people who stood there with their phones up and their coffee cups raised and did absolutely nothing. Just the truck, white and massive and completely indifferent, rolling backward through the February cold while the world looked the other way. Lakenya didn't even have time to scream. Her heel caught the edge of the construction plate. Her coffee hit the ground first. And for one long, terrible second, she was falling right into the path of something that was never going to stop in time. Then a pair of hands found her, firm, steady, certain. She was standing before she understood what had just happened. She spun around, heart slamming against her ribs, desperate to find a face, any face, to attach to those hands. Hard hats, yellow vests, steam rising off the wet pavement, 100 people already moving again, already checking their phones, already turning the whole terrifying moment into an inconvenient delay. He was gone, just like that, like he'd never been there at all. Lakenya was the CEO of a billion-dollar company. She had security cameras on every floor, a head of security on speed dial, and enough authority to make almost anything happen in that building, and she could not find the man who had just saved her life. What she didn't know yet, what nobody had told her, was that somewhere deep inside that same building, someone was already working very hard to make sure she never would. His shift began before the city remembered it was alive. So 4:47 in the morning, and Meridian Tower belonged entirely to Ocampo. Its long corridors silent, its lobby lights dim to a pale gold, its elevators standing open and empty like mouths waiting to be given somewhere to go. He moved through it the way he moved through everything, quietly, deliberately, leaving no footprint louder than necessary. He started on the mechanical floor the way he always did. Pressure gauge on Unit 7. Reading 3 points high, same as yesterday, same notation in the log. Seal on the east coolant line showing the first gray blush of wear. Another note, another week before it needed replacing. He cataloged everything. Every imperfection, every system running a half-degree warmer than it should. He knew this building the way a doctor knows a patient, not from the outside, not from how it looked in the lobby with its polished floors and its tall windows catching the early light, but from the inside, from what was working and what was quietly, slowly, beginning not to. Nobody had ever asked him how he knew. On his break, he sat in the maintenance room with a cup of coffee that had gone lukewarm and his phone propped against a wrench, studying load distribution diagrams for a cable tensioning system 3 floors above where he was sitting. He'd noticed a vibration pattern in elevator 4, barely perceptible, the kind of thing you only caught if you were paying attention, the kind of thing that meant nothing right now and everything in 6 months. He was trying to find the language to write it up in a way that Harris would actually read. He hadn't found it yet. He reached into his chest pocket and took out the photograph. Beverly at her school recital 3 months ago, her hair in 2 careful braids that had taken him 40 minutes and 2 YouTube tutorials to get right, her expression caught somewhere between a smile and the effort of not laughing at something only she could see. He looked at it for a moment the way he always did, without sentimentality, just confirmation. Just the simple act of remembering what the long hallways and the lukewarm coffee and the unread maintenance reports were actually for. He had carried a photograph in that pocket for as long as he could remember. Before Beverly's, it had been his wife's. Rosa had believed he would get his license recognized. She had said it so many times with such complete and uncomplicated certainty that he had almost believed it too. She was still saying it when she got sick. She was still saying something like it, he thought, in the last weeks, though by then the words had become harder to hold on to. What remained was Beverly and the visa and the decision, made quietly on a Tuesday morning in a hospital corridor, to keep showing up. not because the world had made space for him, but because his daughter needed someone who knew how. He put the photograph back. The credentialing process had taken 8 months and cost him more in application fees than he made in 2 pay periods. At the end of it, a letter arrived informing him that his Manila certification did not meet the reciprocity threshold required for Illinois licensure and that he was welcome to begin the examination process from the first stage. He had read the letter twice, folded it in thirds, and placed it in the same drawer where he kept Beverly's birth certificate and Rosa's death certificate and his own passport. Then he had gone to work. That had been 3 years ago. He finished his coffee, rinsed the cup, and returned to the corridor. One last loop, stairwells, loading dock sensors, the basement utility junction that nobody else on the shift ever bothered to check. He checked it. He logged it. He was already composing the elevator for notation in his head when he turned the corner toward the maintenance bay and stopped. The bulletin board by the time clock was covered in the usual layering of shift schedules and safety reminders, and a flyer for a retirement party that had happened 4 months ago. He had walked past it without looking at it so many times it had essentially ceased to exist for him. But something was different this morning. A memo half-tucked under the edge of a weekly roster sheet, the corner of it visible just enough to catch his eye. He almost kept walking, then he stopped and pulled it free. It was brief, 11 lines. The language was formal and unhurried, the kind of language that had been chosen carefully, each word doing exactly the work it was assigned to do and nothing more. He read it once. He read it again. His face did not change. This was something he had learned a long time ago, not to let the difficult things move across his face in places where other people might see. He stood in the empty corridor at 5:43 in the morning with 11 lines in his hand, and he was very still and his expression gave away nothing at all. Then he folded the memo in thirds, the same way he had folded the letter from the credentialing board, the same way he folded everything that mattered and hurt, and he placed it carefully into his chest pocket beside Beverly's photograph, and he went back to work. The alarm sounded at 7:15, the same as it always did. 3 short tones, then a recorded voice asking all personnel to proceed calmly to their designated exit points. Nobody proceeded calmly. They never did. They grabbed their coffees and their phones and their conversations and moved toward the doors in a loose, unhurried current, the way people move when they know the emergency isn't real, but their legs have decided to cooperate anyway. Within 4 minutes, the plaza was full. Ocampo had been out there since 5. The construction plate on the east side of the building's entrance was a notation he'd made in his morning log. Steel-edged, flush with the pavement on 3 sides but slightly raised on the north corner where the ground beneath it had shifted a 1/4 inch in the last freeze cycle. In dry conditions, barely worth a second look. In wet conditions, with a thin film of ice that the morning sun hadn't reached yet, it was something else entirely. He'd flagged it. He'd logged it. He'd sent the note up through the facility system the way he always did, into the quiet digital space where his observations went to be acknowledged by nobody and actioned by the same. He was watching the plate from near the service corridor entrance when the tower doors opened and the crowd began to pour through. He watched it the way he watched everything on the plaza, systematically without urgency, scanning the pavement, the barriers, the angles. The delivery truck from the kitchen supplier had arrived early. It was parked at an awkward angle near the loading bay, the driver inside waiting out the drill. Ocampo had noted it. The truck's rear end was pointed toward the east walkway. The driver's sightlines from the cab would be limited by the temporary construction hoarding on his left side. Ocampo had noted that too. Lakenya came through the main doors with her phone pressed to her ear, mid-sentence, her free hand holding a coffee cup that she hadn't had time to finish and wasn't willing to abandon. She was talking about Q3 projections. She was nodding at something her CFO was saying. Her heels were clicking a quick, efficient rhythm across the pavement, and her eyes were on the middle distance the way the eyes of someone very busy and very certain of their surroundings tend to be. She did not see the construction plate. She did not see the ice on its surface. She did not see the truck beginning to move. But Ocampo saw all three at once: the plate, the ice, the slow reverse arc of 2 tons of steel beginning to swing into the path she was walking. And his body made the decision before his mind had finished forming the thought. He was already moving. He came through the crowd the way water moves through a gap, not forcing, just finding the space that was already there and flowing into it. He reached her in the same moment her heel caught the raised edge of the plate. She was already falling when his hands found her. One at her arm, one at her back, and he pulled, hard and clean, stepping backward and taking her weight with him, rotating her clear of the truck's path in a single motion that lasted, from first contact to full stop, approximately 4 seconds. She gasped. Her coffee hit the ground. The truck rolled through the space where she had been standing, the driver completely unaware, continuing its slow arc until it reached the loading bay and stopped. Ocampo did not wait. He was already moving before she had steadied herself, before her hand had released its grip on his sleeve, before the sound of his own heartbeat had finished its one hard knock against the inside of his chest. 15 feet, 20. He folded himself back into the current of hard hats and yellow vests, matching the pace of the crowd, keeping his head level, his stride unhurried. The practiced geometry of a man who had learned, over many years and in many different rooms, that the fastest way to become invisible was simply to look like you belonged exactly where you were. He did not look back, not at Lakenya, who was standing on the wet pavement with her empty hand outstretched and her eyes scanning the crowd, not at the truck idling innocently at the loading dock, not at the space where something terrible had almost happened and then, very quickly, hadn't. He looked instead at Dodd. Dodd was standing near the service entrance, 20 feet to Ocampo's left, a coffee cup in his hand and his phone in the other. He was not looking at the truck. He was not looking at Lakenya. He was looking directly at Ocampo, had been. Ocampo understood immediately for the last 30 seconds. He had seen everything. And as Ocampo watched, Dodd raised his phone and began to type. Ocampo turned away, kept walking, kept his face neutral and his pace steady and his hands loose at his sides. He moved through the crowd and away from the plaza and back toward the service corridor door, and he did not stop until the door had closed behind him and the noise of the evacuation had been reduced to a muffled vibration on the other side of the glass. Behind him, on the plaza, Lakenya was still searching. A man in a dark coat arrived at her side. Carney, her head of security, pressing an earpiece in and scanning the crowd with the focused expression of someone who understood immediately that something had happened. She turned to him. She told him she needed the footage, every angle, every camera, and every feed from the plaza, pulled and on her screen within the hour. Carney was quiet for just a moment too long. "There may be a problem," he said carefully, "with the construction zone cameras." Lakenya looked at him. "What kind of problem?" Harris's office was on the 3rd floor, tucked behind the facilities operations room, and it smelled the way it always smelled, of old coffee and printer toner and the particular staleness of a space where the window hadn't been opened in months. Dodd sat across the desk with his coffee cup balanced on his knee and described what he had seen on the plaza that morning. He did not use the word rescue. He said, unauthorized entry into a restricted construction zone during an active emergency evacuation. He said, clear violation of the safety protocols that every facilities employee signs acknowledgement of at the start of each contract year. He said, I have it on my phone, I can send it to you right now. The timestamp puts him inside the barrier at 7:22. Harris listened with the expression of a man receiving exactly the information he had been waiting for without knowing he was waiting for it. He asked 2 questions. He nodded twice. Then he picked up his phone and called Therese. By 9:45, Therese was at her desk with Ocampo's personnel file open on her screen and 3 months of documentation spread across her keyboard. Incident reports, shift logs, 2 written advisories, a pattern of minor violations assembled with the kind of patience that only means one thing. She read through Dodd's account again. She read through the file again. Then she began to write, choosing each word the way a person chooses a tool for what it was designed to do and nothing else. By noon, the formal review notice was drafted, printed, signed, and placed in Ocampo's employee mailbox in the basement corridor, the same corridor he'd walked through 6 hours earlier with Beverly's photograph in his chest pocket and a memo folded beside it. Therese reviewed the language one final time before sending the digital copy to HR records. It was, she decided, airtight. She closed the file. 3 floors up in the security suite, Carney's team was doing the slower, quieter work of elimination. The construction zone cameras, 4 of them, positioned along the east face of the building, had been offline between 7 and 7:45 that morning for a scheduled firmware calibration. The work order was dated 11 days prior. It was either routine timing or something worth examining more carefully. And Carney, who had spent 17 years in corporate security and had learned to distrust coincidences the way other people distrusted unlabeled leftovers, filed it in the second category and kept moving. The loading dock camera had been running. It always ran. It was on a separate system, tied to the delivery management software rather than the building's main security network. It was not a high-resolution feed. It was angled for vehicle tracking, not facial recognition, but it had been pointing at the east walkway at 7:22. And when Carney's analyst pulled the frame, there was a figure at the edge of the construction zone, a partial profile orange vest turning away from the camera almost immediately, but there. They ran it against the shift roster. 43 employees on site that morning, 22 in the right part of the building, 14 with access to the east service corridor. By 3 in the afternoon, filtered by build height estimate and the specific shade of the facilities department's early shift vests, they were down to 6. By 5, they were down to 1. Carney printed the name on a plain sheet of paper, the way he always did when he wasn't sure what he was handing someone, and walked it down to Kathleen's desk outside Lakenya's office. Kathleen was the kind of person who understood immediately and without being told, when something required handling before it required presenting. She took the name. She pulled the personnel file herself directly from HR records without explanation. She sat at her desk and read it the way she read everything, quickly, thoroughly, without expression. Then she read it again. The file was not what she had expected. She had expected 3 years of clean service records, a quiet accumulation of satisfactory reviews, the unremarkable paper trail of a man who showed up and did his job. What she found instead was an active disciplinary case, 3 months of documented violations. A formal review notice issued that same morning, time-stamped 11:57 a.m., and at the bottom of the file added within the last hour a calendar entry, termination review meeting, conference room C, Thursday, 9 a.m. She closed the file. She stood up, crossed the small distance between her desk and Lakenya's office door, knocked once and went in without waiting for an answer. She closed the door behind her. She set the file on the desk. Lakenya read it in silence. She did not react, not visibly, not in any way that Kathleen could name afterward except to say that the room felt different while it was happening. Her eyes moved down the first page, down the second. She turned to the documentation section without pausing, read through it, turned back. When she reached the last page, she stopped. She set the file flat on the desk. she asked without looking up in the same tone she used for everything. "Who signed off on this review?" Kathleen told her. Lakenya was quiet for a long moment, long enough that Kathleen almost said something. Then Lakenya looked up. "Clear my Thursday morning." He heard her before he saw her. The scrape of a crayon across paper, slow and deliberate, the sound of someone doing careful work. Ocampo set his bag down by the door the way he always did, in the same spot, against the same wall, with the same quiet efficiency that governed every movement he made in the world outside this apartment. In here, he allowed himself to be a little slower, a little less precise. He hung his jacket on the hook by the door and stood for a moment in the small warmth of the hallway, letting the building's sounds settle around him. The neighbor's television 1 floor up, the pipes adjusting in the walls, Beverly's crayon moving back and forth across the kitchen table. Normal things. He needed normal things tonight. He washed his hands at the kitchen sink, keeping his back to her, watching the water run cold then warm over his knuckles. Beverly had her arm curled around her drawing in a wide protective arc, the way she always did when something wasn't finished yet, guarding it from view with the serious proprietary energy of someone who understood that unfinished things were private things. He dried his hands. He got the rice started. He found the last 2 chicken thighs in the refrigerator and seasoned them the way his mother had shown him a long time ago, in a kitchen that smelled of sampaguita and fish sauce and the particular warmth of a house that was full of people. He did not think about the review notice folded in his chest pocket. He did not think about Thursday. He thought about the rice ratio and whether Beverly had finished her homework and whether the chicken needed another minute on each side. Normal things, steady things, the things that kept the floor under his feet. "Okay," Beverly said. "I'm done." He turned around. She held the drawing up with both hands, chin lifted, watching his face with the calm confidence of someone who already knows the work is good and is simply waiting for the rest of the world to catch up. It was Meridian Tower, unmistakably. She had drawn the antenna at the top with careful zigzag lines, had colored the windows in alternating shades of yellow and orange, had rendered the revolving door at the entrance as a circle divided into 4 neat segments. Near the top of the building, in the large looping letters she still made when she was writing something that mattered, she had written his name above one of the windows. Not at the bottom. Not in the basement level she'd left blank and gray. Near the top, where the windows were biggest, where the light she'd colored was warmest. Ocampo looked at it for a long moment. "That's my office," Beverly said. "I work in the basement," he told her. "I know." She set the drawing flat on the table and smoothed it with her palm once decisively. "But that's where you should be." He looked at his daughter, 9 years old, completely certain, already turning back toward her crayon box to put things away. And he did not cry because he was very practiced at not doing that in front of her. He took the drawing and crossed to the refrigerator. The mango magnet was near the middle, small and yellow, slightly faded. One of 3 things they had carried from Manila that served no practical purpose and that he would not have left behind for anything. He pressed the drawing flat against the refrigerator door and positioned the magnet at the top corner. "Dinner in 10 minutes. He said. "Can I have more rice than last time?" "You can have the same amount of rice as last time." "That's not more." "That's correct," he said, and turned back to the stove. They ate together, and Beverly told him about a disagreement she'd had with a classmate over whether penguins could technically be considered a type of bird, and Ocampo told her they could, and she told him her classmate said they couldn't because they don't fly. And Ocampo said flying is not the definition of a bird, and Beverly said she knew that, she was just explaining what her classmate had said. He listened to all of it. He asked 2 follow-up questions. He was, for the length of dinner, entirely present. Not performing presence, but actually there in the warm kitchen with the rice and the drawing on the refrigerator and his daughter's voice filling up the space. He was very good at this. It was, perhaps, the thing he was best at. Being completely present in the hours before the difficult thing arrived. He put Beverly to bed at 8:30. She requested one story and received it, and one additional story and did not receive it. And then she was quiet, and he turned off the light, and he stood in the hallway for a moment listening to the sound of her breathing slow. Then he went back to the kitchen table. He took the review notice from his chest pocket and unfolded it and read it again in the yellow light above the table. He read the specific language of the charge. Unauthorized entry into a restricted construction zone during an active evacuation, and he read it again, and then he sat with it. The charge was accurate. That was the thing he'd been carrying since noon, the thing he hadn't let himself fully examine until now. Until the apartment was quiet and Beverly was asleep and there was nothing left to tend to but the truth. The charge was technically, procedurally, on paper accurate. He had entered the zone. He could not argue the facts. He could only argue the reason. And arguing the reason meant explaining what he had seen, what he had done, what had happened on that plaza in 4 seconds that nobody apparently wanted to talk about. It meant making himself the center of a story. It meant being looked at, investigated, and discussed in rooms he wasn't in by people who had already decided what kind of man he was. He had spent 3 years learning that this never ended the way you hoped. He folded the notice, set it aside, opened his phone. He would start with his name, he decided. Just his name and the dates and the credentials. He could build from there. He typed his name. He stopped. There, beneath 3 unread shift notifications, was an email he didn't recognize. The sender address was internal, a Vantage Group domain, but the name attached to it meant nothing to him. The subject line was 5 words. Plaza Incident, Thursday. He stared at it. The screen stayed lit for 30 seconds, then dimmed. He didn't move. He turned the phone face down on the table and sat with his hands flat on either side of it, very still. As the way he had stood in the corridor that morning with the memo in his hands. From the bedroom, Beverly called out. Small voice, already half asleep. She needed water. He got up, he filled the glass. He carried it down the hall and handed it to her in the dark, and she drank without fully opening her eyes, and he tucked the blanket back up around her shoulders, and she was asleep again before he had reached the doorway. He stood there for a moment, watching her. Then he went back to the table. He picked up his phone. He turned it over. The email was still there. He opened it. The corridor outside Conference Room C was the kind of quiet that only exists in buildings before the day has fully committed to itself. No voices yet, no footsteps. Just the low hum of the ventilation system and the distant sound of an elevator arriving somewhere above. Ocampo walked it at 8:54 with his file folder under his arm and Beverly's photograph in his chest pocket. He was not walking slowly. He was not walking fast. He was walking at exactly the pace of a man who has made a decision and is simply following it to its conclusion. He had read the email 3 times the night before. He knew who was going to be in that room. He knew something was different. And yet, when he reached the door and put his hand on it, he felt the same thing he had always felt in front of rooms like this one. The old, familiar weight of knowing that whatever was about to happen, he was going to face it quietly and with his shoulders level. And without giving anyone in that room the satisfaction of watching him brace. He pushed the door open and went in. Harris was at the head of the table. Dodd sat to his left, a legal pad in front of him, a pen already in his hand. Therese was to Harris's right, with a folder open and her reading glasses on. The picture of HR competence. Every document in its proper order. They looked up when he entered. Nobody said good morning. Ocampo sat down across from them, set his folder on the table, and placed his hands flat on either side of it. The charges were read. Harris's voice was practiced and even. The voice of a man who had done this before and found the doing of it unremarkable. Unauthorized entry into a restricted construction zone during an active emergency evacuation. Violation of Facilities Safety Protocol, Section 4. Subsection C, combined with the prior documented advisories, grounds for termination of employment effective upon conclusion of this review. Ocampo was offered the opportunity to respond. He looked at the table. He had drafted a response the night before, after he had closed the email and sat for a long time in the kitchen dark. He had written 4 sentences. He had read them back and understood, as he always eventually understood, that the sentences were true and that the truth was not the point. The point was what they had already decided, and what they had already decided was visible in the alignment of the folders, the set of Dodd's shoulders, the particular way Therese had her pen ready, not to take notes but to sign. He said nothing. The silence stretched for a moment that felt longer than it was. Harris drew a breath to continue. The door opened. It opened without a knock, without an apology, without any of the social preamble that signals a person entering a space that belongs to someone else. It simply opened, and Lakenya walked through it, and behind her came Carney, and behind Carney came Kathleen with a tablet held flat in both hands, like something being carried with care. Harris's mouth closed. Lakenya did not look at him. She crossed to the side of the table, set the tablet flat on its surface, and turned it to face the room. She pressed play. The loading dock footage was not beautiful. It was grainy and gray and angled for vehicles, not people. But it was clear enough. 7:22 a.m., February 11th, the timestamp burning white in the upper corner. And there, at the edge of the construction zone, unmistakably, a man in an orange vest moving with the decisive speed of someone responding to something the rest of the world hadn't seen yet. And there, in the path of the reversing truck, a woman in a dark coat beginning to fall. And then the 4 seconds. The reach, the pull, the rotation. The truck passing through the space where she had been. Harris stared at the screen. Dodd's jaw moved almost imperceptibly, a small tightening at the hinge. Therese's pen went still against the page. Lakenya let the footage run 3 more seconds before she stopped it. She described in a voice that was even and unhurried what the footage showed. Then she described what she remembered: the ice beneath her heel, the sound of the truck that she had not processed as sound until it was already past her. The cold certainty of a pair of hands that found her before she had finished falling. Then she looked at Harris. She asked him, directly and without theater, to explain how the footage they were all currently looking at constituted a fireable safety violation. Harris opened his mouth. The explanation that had seemed so structured and airtight at 9 this morning had somewhere in the last 45 seconds lost its architecture entirely. What came out was not a sentence. It was the beginning of one, and then silence. Dodd tried. He said something about protocols, about the principle of the thing, about liability exposure regardless of outcome, about how the authorization requirements existed precisely because good intentions were not a substitute for procedure. Lakenya said his name, just his name once, quietly. Dodd stopped. Therese closed her notebook. Lakenya told the room in the same unhurried tone she had used for everything that the formal review case was dismissed effective immediately. She told them that she would be examining the processes that had allowed this file to be constructed over the past 3 months. She told Harris and Dodd that she would see them both separately this afternoon, and she let that sentence settle into the room without adding anything to it. Then she turned to Ocampo. He had not moved. He had not spoken. He was still sitting with his hands flat on the table, his file folder in front of him, Beverly's photograph in his chest pocket. He had watched all of it with the same expression he had worn since he sat down. Not blank exactly, but contained. A man who had learned to keep the difficult things from moving across his face in rooms where other people might see. She looked at him for a moment, then she asked him a question. "What did you do?" she said, "before this job?" The room was very quiet. Ocampo looked at her, at the directness of the question, the absence of performance in it, and something in him made a small, careful decision. He told her, not everything and not all at once, but enough. The civil engineering license, the load-bearing structures he had designed in Manila, the stress calculations, the buildings that were still standing because he had done his work precisely. The 8 months of the credentialing process and the letter and the drawer where he kept it alongside Beverly's birth certificate. The 3 years of maintaining a building that he understood more completely than anyone in it had ever thought to ask. Lakenya listened. She did not nod along to show she was listening. She did not arrange her expression into something sympathetic. She simply listened the way a person listens when they are actually hearing what is being said, and when he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she asked one follow-up question. She stood, she reached across the table and shook his hand, not the brief transactional handshake of a CEO concluding a meeting, but the handshake of someone who means the gesture. And she said, "I'd like to continue this conversation. Not today. You've had enough of this room, but soon." 3 weeks later, a facilities infrastructure review generated a position posting on the internal job board. Systems Integration Coordinator, Meridian Tower. The description was specific in the way that only descriptions written with a particular person in mind tend to be. Ocampo read it at the kitchen table on a Saturday morning, Beverly beside him working through a bowl of cereal with the focused energy of someone who takes breakfast seriously. He read it once, he read it again. He set his phone down and was quiet for a moment that was longer than Beverly, who noticed most things could let pass without comment. She looked at him. "Is everything okay?" He looked at his daughter. Her careful braids, her cereal spoon paused halfway to her mouth, her expression carrying the particular gravity of a 9-year-old asking a question she actually wants answered. "Yes," he said, and this time when he said it, it was simply true. He took Beverly's drawing of Meridian Tower off the refrigerator that weekend. He bought a frame for it, a plain wooden one, nothing elaborate, and he did not hang it in the apartment. He carried it to work on Monday morning and set it on the desk of his new office on the 14th floor, where anyone walking past the open door could see it. A crayon building with a zigzag antenna, windows colored in alternating orange and yellow, and near the top written in the large looping letters of a child who had always been completely certain, a name, his name, where it belonged. Some people save a life and wait to be thanked. Some people save a life and disappear because they've learned through long and patient experience that being seen costs more than the silence. And the hardest thing Ocampo ever did wasn't pulling her from the path of that truck. It was learning to stay in the room afterward and believing for the first time in 3 years that the room was also his.